1982 was a breakthrough year for electronic music. The introduction of relatively cheap synthesizers and drum machines in the late 1970s opened new pathways and new musical forms. This gave greater opportunity for people to record their own music outside of the regular music industry and develop individualistic styles, and with the help of others, new music genres. In New York, we had the birth of electro with Africa Bambaataa and the Soulsonic Force's Planet Rock. To the west, 615 miles away, another form of electronic music was being instigated and explored by an inquisitive pair of minds, a style that would inform dance music genres of today. During the previous year in Belleville, just outside Detroit in the state of Michigan, was a duo who had had local success with a 7-inch single, Alleys of Your Mind. Heavily influenced by Ultravox's track Mr. X and other electronic artists that preceded them like Kraftwerk, Alleys of Your Mind was a pure electronic record, however couldn't be assigned to a specific genre. It certainly wasn't UK New Romantic, European New Wave synth pop, krautrock or P-funk, but contained all of those elements, like electro, but in a new form. Their second single, Cosmic Cars, released in 1982, cemented this new sound as unique. This group was called Cybertron, and this music would become known as techno. Welcome to Innovator number 5, one half of Cybertron, also known as Model 500, Infinity, owner of Metroplex Records, nicknamed Obi-Wan. I present Juan Atkins. So where does it all begin? Well, interested in music from a young age, Juan Atkins first dabbled with bass guitar and drums, before gravitating towards a Korg MS-10 when he was 17 years old in 1979. He convinced his grandmother to buy this keyboard and essentially from that first day began creating electronic music. Although it was a monophonic keyboard with some limitations, he was able to create drum sounds and patterns by filtering the white noise function and recording these structures onto tape, and then overdubbing using a second tape recorder to create synth lines. Living around the Detroit area at the time exposed Atkins to a local FM DJ called The Electrifying Mojo, who had huge influence on Atkins' musical tastes. In turn, Atkins would turn his two best friends onto Mojo, Derek May and Kevin Saunderson, educating them in all forms of funk and electronic music played over the airwaves. During this time whilst at community college, he met Rick Davis and eventually they began working together. A number of years older than Atkins, Davis had already released a record that was, although electronic in nature, more like ambient soundscapes. But this showed Atkins that you didn't need to be signed to a major label in order to release your music. Atkins was also organising parties at the time for high school students with Derek May, under the name Deep Space Soundworks. And all of these aspects to Atkins' musical life began to coalesce when Atkins and Davis, now calling himself 3070, pressed their first single, Alleys of Your Mind, under the name Cybertron. Detroit had been in the heartland of the automotive industry and had prospered right up until the mid-1960s. However, the automation of the motor industry, i.e. bringing in machines to replace manual workers, led to huge levels of unemployment. The 1967 Detroit riots were among the most violent and destructive riots in US history. Racial tension had been building in the city, with the mainly white police department seen as an occupying force. Accusations of racial profiling and police brutality were commonplace amongst Detroit's black residents. After a raid on an illegal party held at the United Community League for Civic Action, riots then ensued. By the time the bloodshed, burning and looting ended after 5 days, 43 people were dead, 342 injured, nearly 1,400 buildings had been burnt down, and some 7,000 National Guard and US Army troops had been called into service. With the lack of work, there was also the lack of money for individuals, leading to the closure of other businesses and a migration of people from the city. Greater disparity between rich or moderately well-off and poor became greater. By the time of the late 1970s, Detroit had been in a constant economic and social decline. This slow death of the city resulted in its declaring bankruptcy in 2013. Juan Atkins and his friends were only too aware of the impact this had had on their community. Alvin Toffler published his book, The Third Wave, in 1980. It presents a historical overview of the past two human civilizations, the waves as he calls them, and projects the third one that is in the process of unfolding as change sweeps across the globe. The three waves are described as: the first wave began thousands of years ago when everybody worked the land through to the development of civilization up until the mid-17th-18th centuries. The second wave describes an industrial society and urbanization of towns and cities, new forms of economy, mass production through to mass destruction, i.e. World War II. The third wave began post-World War II due to the speed of advancement of technology, thinking, and other socio-political drivers like individual rights, freedoms, democratization, and the internationalization of trade and movement of goods and services, and things like fracking and other forms of harvesting energy that could have an ecological effect on the world. As Toffler states in the book, with information becoming more important than ever, the new civilization will restructure education, redefine scientific research, and, above all, reorganize the media of communication. Instead of being culturally dominated by a few mass media, third wave civilization will rest on interactive, demassified media, feeding extremely diverse and often highly personalized imagery into and out of the mind stream of the society. And what does this all have to do with Juan Atkins? Well, we do see this today with the proliferation of Facebook and other forms of social media, the internet, and the growth of the online community, forms of global monitoring of individuals by government agencies, and greater divisions between poor and the wealthy. There are also advances in medicines and sciences that we've seen, and the replacement of man by machine in the workplace. Those individuals that see some of these advancements as threat to society as a whole, i.e. the increased unemployment, government control and monitoring, data collection on people for whatever purposes, damage to ecology, to technology, etc., are called techno-rebels in Toffler's book. And he says that the techno-rebel stance is either we control technology or it controls us. Toffler says the techno-rebels are, whether they recognise it or not, agents of the third wave. They will not vanish but multiply in the years ahead, for they are as much part of the advance to a new stage of civilization as our mission to Venus, our amazing computers, our biological discoveries, or our explorations of the oceanic depths. And this is what informed Cybertron and shaped their music as a form of commentary on how they saw things. With a prominent electronic backdrop, albeit now aided by John 5 on guitar, in the words of Simon Reynolds in his book Energy Flash, presented in the lyrics, Davis handled a lot of the philosophical aspects of what was a highly conceptual project. Song titles and lyrics were abstract, futuristic and technology-driven, and the music synthetic, dance-orientated and very funky. With the support of the electrifying mojo, released on Atkins' own label Deep Space, the single Alleys of Your Mind sold around 15,000 copies in the local Detroit area, and slowly they were picked up by other black-orientated radio programs around the country. They then became more successful with the releases Cosmic Cars and Clear, and garnered the attention of Californian label Fantasy, who signed them for an album. The album Enter was released in 1983. Also confusingly, this album was reissued with the title Clear. But soon after, Davis and Atkins split, with Davis retaining the name Cybertron. And essentially this was due to differing opinions on where the music should go next. Juan Atkins wanted the music to become more electronic, whereas Davis preferred a more rock and roll stroke pop approach. And so Atkins started working on his own under the moniker Model 500, taking with him some of the ideas he'd been working on when he was working with Rick Davis. After rejections from other labels and remembering the success with the self-released Alleys of Your Mind, Atkins formed Metroplex and released No UFOs in 1985. This particular track and its follow-up, Night Drive Through Babylon, although still retaining some elements of an electro sound, suggested in the words of Tim Barr from The Rough Guide to Techno, Atkins had somehow reached beyond previous pop templates to create a revolutionary new sound. However, this music still had no name. Metroplex and Model 500 went from strength to strength, and Juan's influence continued to grow. Juan's friends and associates began to write their own material, Derek May under the names Mayday and Rhythm is Rhythm, and Kevin Saunderson as Cream, Reese, and many other aliases. Some of these tracks appeared on Metroplex. However, the real influence that Juan had was that he inspired his friends to start their own very influential labels. And although each artist was different, the Detroit sound was now developing with Juan leading the charge. It should be noted that these Detroit-based records were very popular in Chicago during the early development of the house scene. Chicago had always been a disco city, so it was inevitable that disco would morph into house. However, the seeds of the Detroit sound also helped shape house through the influence of these electro and funk-infused tracks. The UK was also an early adopter of the Detroit sound. In the early days of acid house, DJs buying house imports were discovering that many of their favourite tracks were actually from Detroit rather than Chicago. When licensing tracks for a compilation of Detroit artists for the UK market, Neil Rushton searched for a title for the album. He'd noted that the number of Detroit artists producing music in a similar vein, and then wanted to showcase this, and so he'd already licensed material from the Bellevue Three, i.e. Atkins, May and Saunderson, and was then keen to market and capitalise on this new sound. Released in 1988, the album was going to be called The House Sound from Detroit. However, noting the differences in sounds between that of the Chicago sound and Detroit sound, and taking a cue from Atkins's track, the album was renamed Techno, the New Dance Sound of Detroit. A genre was born. The UK music press lapped it up, and British journalists visiting Detroit were fascinated by this new technological music created in response to Toffler's vision. In the words of Tim Barr for the May edition of The Face magazine, Stuart Cosgrove provided a seductive manifesto recorded almost verbatim from those at the centre of the new music. Theories behind the music were offered, such as Alvin Toffler's idea of the third wave. In the article Welcome to the Future, Techno by John Macready, published in The Enemy on the 16th of July 1988, he describes the techno rebels as musical agents of the third wave who see the fusion of man and machine as the only future. At the time, Juan Atkins was then quoted as saying, "The Detroit Underground has been experimenting with technology, stretching it rather than just using it. As the price of sequencers and synthesizers has dropped, so the experimentation has become more intense. Basically, we're tired of hearing about being in love or falling out, tired of the R&B system, so a new progressive sound has emerged. We call it techno." Acknowledging that the synth aesthetics of Kraftwerk and the funk music of Parliament Funkadelic have had the strongest influence on him, Atkins, interviewed in Music Technology magazine in 1988, also argued that the music is not for everybody, it's for certain people that want a little twist. Some people are perfectly content with everyday pop, they don't have an open enough mind to consider something new. Those aren't the people I'm playing for. They'll come around eventually because they're basically followers. When they're told that this is what's happening, they'll go along with it. The techno producers following Juan Atkins's wake had formed a sound that had different musical features from other more commercial dance music such as house, for example faster tempos, more variety of drum patterns and effect processing, and more exclusive use of electronic instruments rather than acoustic instruments such as piano or drum sounds, and mainly absent of vocals. With British and European interest in techno, it wasn't long before new bastardised versions of this genre would appear. Atkins, May and Saunderson suddenly found themselves in demand as DJs in Europe, playing in front of crowds of 5,000 in comparison to their home crowds of 500. This demand meant that they were less able to focus on their labels and developing their own music as quickly, and this brought forward what would become the second wave of Detroit producers, such as Underground Resistance, Mike Banks, Jeff Mills and Robert Hood, Richie Houghton and John Acquaviva with their label Plus 8, Drexciya and James Pennington aka Suburban Night, plus others. Cross-pollination of these sounds from the USA, Europe and UK would then spawn new subgenres and styles that would inform more dominant dance music genres to come, such as hardcore. In the words of Hans Zeiner Hendrickson, when British producers started to create their own electronic dance music tracks, these Detroit musicians became an important inspiration, both musically and intellectually. Within a few years, techno had become one of the most dominant genres of electronic dance music, signifying anything instrumental and electronic, whether it was intended for dancing or simply listening. While producers of house music undoubtedly made dance music, techno producers were also exploring other directions, transporting the music away from the dance floor. Unfortunately for Juan Atkins, he didn't reach the same level of success as Kevin Saunderson at this point in their respective careers. And when I talk about success, really I'm talking about record sales and monetary gain. Saunderson essentially went overground with Inner City and had huge international success with the singles Big Fun and Good Life. However, his was a more commercial sound that appealed to a wider audience. It should also be noted that during the early 1990s, for all of the Bellevue Three, because of issues with the deals they struck or other complications within their musical careers, each struggled to maintain their early success and reach larger audiences, whereas the style of music they originated went from strength to strength. Juan Atkins has maintained a strong presence in the techno scene throughout his career, despite maybe not having a more financially rewarding career as others. However, he has kept to his principles within the music content without softening his sound or altering it to suit major record label demands. He's remained dedicated to his sound and production values, moving techno forward, whether under the name Model 500, Infinity, or with collaborations such as 3MB or the Borderline project of recent years. Without Juan Atkins, techno may not have existed in the form that it does. It might not even have a name. However, because of the influences of Kraftwerk and Parliament Funkadelic, New Romantic and New Wave synth pop, and how Atkins melded them together into new forms way back in the early 80s, he's part of the bedrock that is electronic dance music in all its forms, and hence Juan Atkins is innovator number 5. Thanks very much. See you next time.